If you're a veteran animator with not a lot of time on your hands, but you want to take a stab at Cascadeur, then this video is for you. I'm your 3D CG guru, Nathaniel Albright, and in this video series, I'm going to attempt to show you what I think are the core concepts and fundamental skills you need to have inside of Cascadeur so you can start creating great looking animations in record time. So let's get started. Let's go ahead and load the standard model mail. Viewport navigation is the same as Maya. Alt left click to rotate, Alt middle click to pan, and Alt right click to zoom in and out, or we can also use the mouse wheel. In the top right corner, we have the standard kind of controls we're used to seeing in 3D applications to allow me to jump between different views, and we can click on the cube in the middle to jump between perspective and orthographic views. To the top left corner, please take a note of this little icon here and the arrow to the right of it. If we click on this, this expands to let us see our viewport in different modes. Inside of Cascadeur, what you really need to understand is a character has a number of different layers of control modes. So we have our base skeleton here, and then we can choose what type of control rig we want to animate on top of this. We'll get into these later in the video. All of these different settings in here are changing settings for the viewport. If you want to see those settings for your viewport, you can right click here, and then we can choose what we want to enable or disable. Let's switch over to the auto pose mode here. The way I view this is essentially auto pose is going to be our rough posing of the character, and then we can refine our poses as we approach the skeleton. Let's go ahead and talk about our transformation tools. The hotkeys for the transformation tools are the same as we have inside of Maya. So we can do Q to select objects, W to select translation, E for rotation. Notice there is not a hotkey for scale. That R button does something different. If we go to the top left corner of the taskbar, these are the hotkeys that we're changing. If we want to switch between local and world space, we hit the tilde key. And if we want to adjust the size of our gizmo here, we can hold down Control, right click and drag, and we can scale like this. Note that when you hold down Control and right click, it's really looking at the cursor, as far as I can tell at least, looking at the cursor distance from this point. So I can just click here to make it large, click here to make it small. I'm usually one that makes sure I actually get comfortable with the hotkeys that an application gives versus what I want the hotkeys to be. However, inside of Cascadeur, I have constantly found myself hitting F to frame my selection over years of that always being the hotkey. But in Cascadeur, F actually adds or removes keyframes, and T is essentially the framing mechanism. You can think of T as target. If you want to change those hotkeys, like I have, you can go to Settings, the hotkey editor. When the editor is brought up, you can simply type in camera here to filter, go to your view, and then under view, go ahead and assign the F for framing, and then go over here and type in key, and under the timeline, set T for adding or removing a key. Let's switch over to point controller mode to talk about how we can select objects. If I single click on an object and I translate it, I will get this behavior. If I want the entire arm to move or the forearm down to move, I need to double click on this, and now I'll be moving the forearm as a group. This is definitely much different than we're used to for control rigs inside of other applications. Also note that if I select a single object and I try to rotate it, you're going to get an error saying it can't rotate itself. Essentially, when we're doing rotation, we always need at least 2 points selected in order to understand the orientation of the object. Selection hotkeys are as follows. Essentially, we can assign 1, 2, 3, 4. We can run all the way up the number chain to assign selection sets for ourselves. So if I double click on the upper body here and I hit Control 1, I have assigned this set of selected points as a hotkey to the number 1. So I can hit 1 and that is selected. I will double click and select my left arm and do Control 2, and then I will double click to select my right arm and do Control 3. So now if I hit 1, I have everything. If I hit 2, I am removing the left arm from the selection. 3, I'm removing from the selection. I will just click inside of the viewport, and then I can toggle between these two. If I want to just jump from one and not really do a toggle, I can hold down Alt, and that will actually jump between the different selections versus adding or removing them. The character controller also has this blue icon here. This represents the center of mass, and I can use this to move the entire character. The center of mass is based off of the collision capsules that we have associated with our rig at the rig level. The center of mass also has a point projected onto the ground plane. So this is nice. If I take my selection and I move my leg up like this, my character right now is not balanced because I can see the center of mass is not over my planted foot. So I can either take my planted foot and move it over that, or I could take my upper body in this case and move it over. I hold down Shift to add to my selection in this case, and then I can move this over like so. The pose of my character does not look so great right now. I'm going to go ahead and use auto posing to do this initial pose and talk about the differences here. So if I go and I click on this right here, we can enable auto pose, and we essentially have a simplified skeleton with these green dots. Blue means these are being used to solve the pose. Green means I can select this and add some additional information. As soon as I actually move this, you'll see my character now changes its pose quite a bit. And as I move this around, if I look, this is now blue. This means that this is a point that I have been modified to get this pose in this position. If I go ahead and take another point here and move it, it will also turn blue. If I marquee select, the system's smart enough to know that I want to just only move the things that are blue. I don't want to add any additional points into the solver. So the auto posing system is going to try to solve all the green points for us automatically. The more blue points you have, the more complicated the solve is going to be. If I take this point here, for example, and I rotate it, you'll see now that the fingers are defined, they become blue as well. If you want to take a point and remove it so it's not something that you have overridden with your own values and you want the solver to do the solve for you, select your points, go to the right here under the outliner window. Down here, we have these different categories. This is kind of similar to behaviors inside of Unity, and I can just unlock these. Once a control is unlocked, the auto pose will solve this for us. The auto pose system is really good for getting those initial poses blocked in. Then you can switch over to point controller mode if you want to refine anything. And then from there, we can go to this mode here, which allows us to uh, pose things at a even smaller detail. So here we actually have, for example, the finger controls that we want to use. Notice here I have all of these finger controls selected, but the fingers themselves are not actually curling. And this is related to this function here called local tail mode. If I enable this, I get this little swirl mode, and now all of these will rotate together instead of rotating just based off of the highest level parent. Let's talk about the time range. We have our standard kind of buttons down here for setting our time range. We can adjust this to a smaller range. If you right click, it'll jump back to the full range. Also, if we want the time range just to match the last key in the frame range, we can hit this button over here. All animations actually have to start on frame 0, and I only have one key. Let's go ahead and add another key. I'm going to jump to time frame 7. And in my case, my hotkey for adding a key is T, but the default is F. We can go to the key button here to see what your hotkey would be. So go ahead and hit T or F, whatever it is for you, to add a keyframe. The keyframe has to exist first before we do any poses. If we attempt to do some posing and there's not a keyframe on that frame, it's not going to really work out for you. You'll see it just keeps popping back. So that's one thing that's different compared to something like Maya. You have to be on a keyframe before you can start setting data. So let me go ahead here and just make some garbage pose real quick. All right, so we have this. And another thing that's kind of interesting here with Cascadeur is the fact that we actually set the interpolation per an interval. So an interval is any time between one set of keys and the other. So if I go in here and then create one more kind of set of poses, let's just do something like this. Send a face plant here. See, I can't do that, so I need to hit T for key. And let's grab this and do something like this. We can see that we now have this happening. Now, if we want to create an interpolation between these, we do that with this icon right here. And if we open this up, you're going to see there's different ways of doing the interpolation. You'll also notice that even though my current time is here, when I hit this button here to add a Bezier interpolation, it actually created the interpolation over here. And that's because my setting here is deciding if the interpolation that I set is based off of the current time or the selected range, and I had this key selected at the time. So just that's one thing that's also unique to Cascadeur is this idea that you can have selected ranges and then your cursor can be in another location, and the functions that you enact will behave differently based off of this selection here. So we have a few different types of interpolation. The Bezier interpolation is going to produce a nice smooth result. And if we look at this, we get this motion now. And then on top of that, we have a viscous Bezier. Essentially, as I'm moving through the keyframes, there'll be less overshoot with the viscous is the best way to kind of visualize that. And then finally, we have a clamped keyframe as well. And that would be anytime that a limb is in a similar place within 3D space, there should be no kind of overshoot or the motion will be clamped, similar to like a clamped F curve inside of Maya. The difference is this stuff is being solved kind of in the 3D space, not really just the individual value of a single axis within our translation. The characters themselves are essentially on tracks. So you'll notice as I go over here to the right, I can expand and I can set different types of interpolation for each of these different limb segments. There's controls here we won't go into in this video for adding and modifying the groups that we have for this character, but I generally initially start at least with the full body before I do any types of refinement. Your hotkeys are A to go back a frame, D to go forward, and then Shift A or Shift D to jump just to the keyframes themselves. If you have interpolation enabled and you actually want to see that stepped preview mode, it's this little button right here. And now when I play, you'll see we get just the step preview mode for this character. One thing that I really love with the timeline is the ability to adjust the timing of my animation really easily. If we do the minus key, we take keys away from the current time, or we do the plus sign or the add, we're going to be adding keys to our interpolation. I guess there's actually a few different keys that we didn't talk about here. There's the standard kind of linear interpolation that we have, and then we also have essentially the stepped mode. Those obviously you use a lot less. There's also a fixed mode, and I'll talk about the fixed mode in a moment. Additionally, if we left click and drag, we can select a range of keys, and you'll see one of the nicest things they give us visually is it gives us a frame count, how many frames do we actually have selected. And I can select this and I can do Control T to adjust the timeline there. Now, when I do that, you'll notice that my timeline here for the interpolation keys becomes green, and that's because I have this checked right here. It says fixed interpolation on change interval. So what that means is that we have modified our interpolation. We've stretched that interpolation. And so the way I view fix is essentially like baked keys, but inside of Maya, when you have a bunch of baked keys, visually they're no different than standard keyframes. In Cascadeur, we can visually see that that data has been kind of baked. I'm not really interpolating off of the base interpolation. I'm actually preserving the positions and everything just stretched out. Early on in your animation process, you'll likely want to turn this option off and allow things to just kind of keep the interpolation data the way it wants. So here, once again, if I Control T and then scale this down, you'll see that I just let the interpolation do its thing. As you get closer to being complete with your animation, turning on the fix might be a more appropriate time to do this. Also, if you want to stretch those keys out rather than using the hotkey, it's simply this button right here on the UI. We can flag some keys as being more important than others with the little flag button. It doesn't do anything inside of the software. It's just a visual guide for you if you want to identify critical poses versus maybe some type of breakdowns. And another thing that really tripped me up initially with Cascadeur is that we have the ability to define interpolation either being IK or FK, but it's not only just on the keys, but it's also in the interpolation itself. So over here, you'll see there's a drop down or a uh, set of options for setting FK keys or IK keys, and then a global rotation key, which we'll talk about in a moment. Generally, for actual keyframes, setting IK or FK, you're not going to see a visual difference as far as how the animation is processed. It's really going to change the behavior of when you're copying keys. If I'm copying the keys of a keyframe and it's an FK and my character is out here in space, he's going to stay out here in space. If I'm copying a key and they're in IK, and my character was originally out here and I copy a key from another location, it'll move the character back in space. So I kind of view it as, is this data in world space or local space? One quick way we can copy keys is to simply click on a key and just shift middle click and drag, and that'll copy that pose to a later frame. Now, just like the keyframes themselves, there is interpolation options here, and this is where we can start to see some differences in the way the animation may interpolate depending on if the interpolation is set to FK or IK. And if we zoom in here, We can see a little FK when it's in FK interpolation, and when it's in IK, we don't get anything because that's kind of the default. Now, global rotation is going to be something that's easier to explain once we talk about trajectory edits, and so we will kind of gloss over the global rotation for now. Other things to know about the timeline is playback options are over here on the far right. And if we choose something at the time factor, this is actually going to, the way I view it, it's going to produce subsample, so we actually get a slower motion. It's not just playing the animation back at a slower rate. We are getting a really smooth playback still. So we're getting sub-frame interpolation of the animation data. I want to jump over to another animation here to talk about one thing we can do as far as editing animations. And there's really two things we're going to cover. One's going to be some editing that we can do right in the timeline. And then the other one, the most critical one, is probably going to be related to the trajectory tools. But first I want to point out that I went to File and I opened a scene. And one of the other unique things here inside of Cascadeur is that you can have multiple scenes open and they become tabs. It allows you to copy data from one scene, paste it into another one. So I have this scene here and it's just a backflip. And what I want to do is I want to modify this so that the character jumps at a higher location before landing. I'm going to click on my one frame here at the frame where he's just about to leave. And I want to find the point that the character makes contact with the ground again. So I'm going to left click and hold. Notice the animation is scrubbing at this point, so I can find exactly where the animation is making its contact point, which is going to be here. Now, if I wanted to lift this character up, one really great set of tools they have for editing animation is these tools right here. So it's just collapsed by default. And if we cursor over this, it says interval edit mode. So this is going to allow us to modify a series of keys all at once. So we're going to turn that on. And when I do that, this turns red. So I'm going to marquee my character. And let's say I want the top of the jump to be taller. If I grab this right now and I pull this character up, it's not going to give us what we want. Instead, what happened here is the entire animation from this frame on all moved up uniformly. So I applied a consistent offset to the entire animation. So I'm going to undo that. This is also a good time to point out this is another example of where the fixed interpolation may come into play for certain people. So if we turn that on and I pull this up right now, you'll see that we get these baked keys here as well. So, so things might be a little bit different for people there. Okay, so I'm going to turn that fixed interpolation on interval edit off and expand these options. So rather than applying a global offset to everything, we have two additional choices we have. So this is a linear offset. So if I take this and I pull this up here, now you're going to see the character linearly interpolates up to this point, which is essentially where my cursor was on frame 68. So you can say at frame 66, there's 0 offset applied, and it linearly applies that offset to here, and then it linearly goes back down like so. And alternatively, what we could do, rather than doing a linear offset, and let me just turn off these trajectory paths here to make this a little bit easier to see, is we can also select this option here. So now we're going to get kind of a flat interpolation at the beginning, but it's in a curve out at the top and round back down to the end of the selected range. So this gives me something where I get a smooth, and then I hang out the top more, and then I come back down like so. Now, obviously, this is really horrible. That doesn't match at all as far as the speed of the character and what's happening. But the linear option is really nice if you have a character walking through space. And let's say he starts here, and then at this point, he's way over here, and you want to maybe get the character walking in place versus through space. I will switch to linear mode and then just move them back to the 0 location, and then they're animating in place. So it's a really quick way to kind of compress that animation into a spot. Or if I have an animation that's in place and I want to get them moving through space, I would go into linear mode, go to the last frame of my selection, and just pull that out, so then I can see the character moving through space. All right, let's wrap this video up by talking about probably the most important thing you need to know with regards to tools for editing our animation, and that's related to our trajectory tools. The trajectory tools are up here in the middle area of the top of the taskbar. There's quite a few settings here. To begin with, I'm just going to, actually, before we even get to that, a few other things I should point out. So this is a work in progress animation. I'll go ahead and just hit play real quick so everyone can see what's happening in the scene. And a few things. Notice right here, I've got these red lines. This is letting me know essentially that the limbs are essentially hyperextended. So that definitely is kind of a problematic area. I don't want my limb lengths to grow. Also, you'll notice in the timeline that we have a lot of red. We didn't talk about what this red is. All that really means is that if we expand our track, that there's some differences in the interpolation types between the subtrack. So here for the arms in particular, I have to go all the way down here to this arm before I see what's happening here. So really, whenever I see red, it just means, hey, there's tracks below it with different interpolation modes enabled. Also, another thing that Cascadeur has that's really nice is the S key will let us toggle off these control rigs really fast. So if I want to preview my animation without all that garbage on the screen, I can just hit S and do that. Okay, so let's get back to the trajectory tools. The trajectory tools sit here in the center of the taskbar. I'm going to go ahead and select my center of mass. And by default, we need to turn the trajectory tool on. So I'll go up here to the top and I'll just click on this little icon. And I still don't see anything in my viewport because by default, the trajectory only shows up when you actually have a time range selected in the timeline, like so. In this animation, I really tried to exaggerate this big wind up and then this unexpected fast attack. So we see a pretty sudden drastic change in the velocity of our center of mass, or the overall weight of the character. In this case, that is intended, but it's also a really nice visual way to let you identify if you have some um, timing issues in your animation. If I go in here and I suddenly grow this out a lot, like so, uh, this would seem, if I'm supposed to just be doing a smooth animation, this would probably let me know my spacing's a little off here. So if I go back here, I can kind of reduce those interpolation keys until I get a more even spacing of the center of mass of my character. So that's one nice little trick. The other thing is, if you have a really long animation like this, sometimes you're working on some subsection of the animation. You don't want to have to constantly make sure that you have your active area that you're interested in selected. So once you select an area, you can go up here to the top and click on this, and that will lock the trajectory to that sub range. And you'll see the little start and end flags that let me know that's the area that I'm viewing my trajectory with. Also, the trajectory paths automatically or by default will switch as I select different things. But let's say in this case, I always want to see this trajectory. What I can do is I can hit the little lock icon right here, and that will lock that trajectory to just the selected object itself. As we move into the path, you will notice some nice little details such as the colorization kind of lets me know what types of keys I'm dealing with. This is really nice, especially if you've been leveraging the things like the set critical key. Those are going to show up with that kind of red highlight. So I know that that's a really important frame I don't want to mess with. Let's jump past just this one object and actually select something different here. So I'm going to select this spine, and I want to go from here up to the head. Now, if I double click on the root here, I get the entire character. So if I click on this and then I hold down Control and double click on the head, it'll grab me everything just along that subsection of the character, which is nice. And I'm going to go ahead and unlock this selection so that I can have this path updated to be my current selection. And here you're going to see that by default, it's showing me just the path information for the root of the character, essentially the highest level parent. And if we go up here to the top and expand this, we have different display options. So I could say essentially the parent trajectory. I could say show me the trajectory of everything that's selected, which is kind of crazy to see. Or I could also do this. And if I do something like this, I can actually start to visualize the shape of the spine, the expansion contraction as a whole. It's also really nice. I've kind of found I really like it for like legs or feet. And then we also have this one that connects all of these. We'll take a look at this in a moment when we're actually talking about looking at the path of this weapon here. So let's go ahead and go back to just the parent trajectory mode. Let's talk about some of the ways we can edit this. What I'm going to do is I'm going to actually expand my track here so I can see just the body. First thing you should be aware of is this is a really nice way to visually see what's happening in terms of your interpolation type. So here's, Bezier, here's the viscous Bezier, here's what a clamp does, stepped. Right now at the beginning of this path, there's not a lot of major differences there. Obviously, the stepped here looks really funky. Let's go back and set this back to Bezier. Now, I should also mention when I did this, I was changing this for everything on my tracks. If I really wanted to do that only for just the body segment, I would want to make sure that I have just the body track selected so that nothing else changes here. All right, so I can simply go to a key, and if I want, I can start to repose this, and we'll see the paths update really fast. Let me see what the new position is. We can also go to the trajectory tool, and to the left of where we set our range, we can actually just say edit. So now I can select, and I could start to make modifications like this. So maybe I don't want this little um, offset where it kind of suddenly goes back. Maybe I want it like this. I can just modify those paths like so. So that is a really nice way to modify um, our animation data directly in the viewport. Really makes the need of having to deal with function curves and the graph editor a lot less important. The other interesting thing we can do is we can actually visualize the orientational information of our objects with the trajectory tool. So I'm going to double click on my sword, and this is what I get. Let me just switch over to this view here. So we can kind of see, as all these points are connected, the orientation or the path of our weapon, but it's a little noisy because we have all these different uh, trajectory paths for each of the objects or control points that make the sword up. Instead of doing this in the translation mode, I'm going to switch the trajectory tools over to rotation. So I'll just click on the R here, and now we get orientational information. Now, what it decides to show on screen depends on our settings. So the first thing I want to do is I want to switch back to parent only mode. So I'm only viewing the information about the rotation for the root of the weapon here. Then I want to go over to my scene settings, and you're going to find a bunch of collapsible options here, and I want to just go to trajectory. So we have right now the rotation is being displayed as the orientation of the object going through world space, and it's also displaying essentially this line based off of what we have selected here. So I have Z, and if we look at this weapon, the Z-axis is the length of the sword. So I can really easily see from this side view that the sword in this section here is kind of hanging behind, and then it flips kind of over the shoulder. If I wanted to modify that, I could do this like so, and I could see that. What really gets interesting is the fact that we can also use this to visualize not just the length, but we can also use it to kind of visualize the twist and roll of the object. So in this case, one of the axes is going to be on the same plane as the sword that's swinging. So in this case, we have this x-axis. And really, right now, what's not working well for my weapon is that while the weapon itself is traveling down a nice clean line, the orientation of the weapon is not really good. And I can see that right now if I use the x-axis. So I'm going to switch over to the x-axis, and we can kind of see how the trajectory tools are, or the trajectory path is not really aligned with the center of the weapon. It feels a little bit more like it's like a cone. And what I mean by that is if I take this and I rotate this like so, you're going to start to see the path kind of converge so that the line is intersecting the actual blade of the weapon. So that lets me know that essentially the roll of this is now matching the path of the swing, which is what I want. Also, if I were to go from the top-down view, and let me just approach it from this angle, and let's look at the y-axis, and let's scrub the animation here. You can see that keyframes around this area are a little bit closer than here at the beginning of the animation and later on, but that spacing is a little hard to visualize. Essentially, my weapon is twisting around as the swing is happening. And so rather than viewing this in global with translation mode, I can view this in just a local space, or in this case, a global space, and we can see that the rolling of the weapon really slows down in this area and then accelerates again. Now, maybe that's what I want and that's okay, but maybe I want this to look like a smoother rotation that's happening consistently as the swing is about to happen. And if I wanted that to be true, now I can just kind of rotate this out and I can see that spacing become more even around this area versus being so kind of clustered together, something like this. So some really cool stuff you can do as far as being able to visualize the rotation of objects with the trajectory tools and make edits there as well. I think this is a good stopping point for this video. Hopefully you can start creating and editing animations inside of Cascadeur. There's still a ton of tools Cascadeur has available to us that we haven't actually covered yet. Things like the global rotation settings that I mentioned earlier, but I said we need to explore after we understood the trajectory tools. There's also ghosting tools, the tween machine system, tools for creating cycles, and then obviously the physics system where we can do things like secondary motions and much, much more. So please make sure you subscribe. That video will be coming out later, and good luck animating.